So in this video, I want to talk to you about a small problem that constantly comes up when you work with VEX, and that is implicit typecasting, or how I call it, data type conversion. So what does that mean? We've actually already seen it a couple of times, and that is the problem when I use a certain data type without me being aware sometimes, and that then the data that is calculated is not done in the way I expect it to be. What does that mean? So for example, we've seen that before when I have a float attribute like value, that when I try this using the current point number and divide it by the number of points that are there, that should give me a number between 0 and 1. But if I do this, I can see that the result will always be 0. So what's happening here is that this is an integer that I divide by an integer, and the result is an integer. In this case, actually, technically, there's not a data type conversion happening, even though I would want it to happen. And this is why there's also the way of using a so-called explicit typecast, which means I explicitly tell one of the two at least that I want it to be a float, and all of a sudden it works because now the result of this part here will be a float. Now this, as you can imagine, can create a lot of trouble because, you expect something to happen that doesn't happen. Another thing where we saw this happening is when we give every point a different color, for example, by using a noise function on the point. This works, and then I want to make this brighter by just multiplying the whole thing with 3, and all of a sudden I get black and white, because what's happening here, and this is now an implicit typecast, this I expect it to be a vector, but since this is an integer, the noise will return something that is not a vector, and actually, funnily enough, in this case it's not an integer but a float. So this whole thing here creates actually a float, which then again is turned into a vector and put in R, G, and B. So very confusing and definitely not expected. So what you can do here is, for example, again, an explicit typecast. So for example, I can turn this 3 into a vector, even though that is a bit strange to be fair. And then what I get is actually a vector that is multiplied with a vector and is returned to a vector. So this then works again. And if I wanted to be absolutely certain, I could do the same for the noise. So this way, there's absolutely nothing going wrong. Another way of doing this, or how I sometimes do it, is this. I just create a vector explicitly like this, and then it works as well. So keep that in mind, because we will run into this problem all the time, and I will always make clear to you when this happens. But it is by kind of a constant problem that happens all the time. And this is one of the reasons why I told you to always add your data type at least to the attribute, because there you might have the same problem. For example, if you do something like this, if I create my own attribute and I know that I might want this to be a vector, but VEX can't know that, so it will by default turn it into a float. So unless I explicitly say it in the result of the noise, so this way, then it will turn into a vector. No, it won't even then. So I always have to explicitly say it should be a vector, but that's not enough. As you've seen, you also have to do this in your calculation. Just make sure that you constantly kind of check what comes out of your lines, so that what you assume is actually correct. Never assume anything is what I tend to do. I always check if what I assume is actually correct. And one of the reasons is the data type. Now, sometimes you can use the explicit typecast to your advantage as well. So for example, if we wanted to create a random number, and this is supposed to be an integer that's supposed to have 3 different numbers, let's say 0, 1, and 2, then what do I do when I create a random result? Because if I do this, what comes out of the random is always between 0 and 1. So what can I do to create a random number between 0 and 3? Sure, in the attribute randomize, I have actually the possibility, as long as the attribute is an integer, to, which this one isn't, I can always say, okay, give me a result between 0 and 2, and this will then work, or maybe 0 and 3. But in VEX, how do I do this? Well, it's actually quite simple, because I can just turn the random into an integer and before that multiply it by 3. This way it will kind of be rounded down once I turn it into an integer, and since this will always create something between 0 and 3, the result will be 0, 1, or 2. And we can actually see that here, that this way we can create random integer numbers by just multiplying basically the amount of random numbers you want and then turn the whole thing into an integer, which can be really helpful if you want to, separate between different objects or different materials or something like that. And when you understand data types, this is actually pretty straightforward. So I hope this is not too abstract, but later on we will see this constantly happening, and then you know what we're talking about. Implicit typecast, explicit typecast, or data conversion, call it what you want, but it's all about the data type and how Vex sees it versus what you expect it to be. So I hope this is helpful. Thanks very much. See you later. Cheers.